Chosen Samantha, Sam, Whittaker. The courtroom doors creaked open just enough for the humid Virginia air to slip inside, carrying the faint scent of marsh grass and distant pine. I stepped through in full dress blues, the wool heavier than memory, the silver buttons catching the overhead fluorescence like small warnings. My father let out a short, involuntary huff, half laugh, half disbelief. My mother's hand flew to the pearls at her throat, as if they might choke her. The judge, a man whose face had seen every shade of regret this county could produce, froze mid-motion, gavel hovering. His whisper drifted across the bench, barely audible over the rustle of files. Lord have mercy, that's her. Every head turned. The bailiff's pen stopped scratching. A teenage clerk dropped her phone, it clattered like a spent casing. For the first time in 34 years, Robert and Margaret Whittaker had nothing to say. 2 days earlier I'd been on my knees in the front yard of the little cedar, shingled house I'd bought with my first disability check, wrestling a stubborn patch of kudzu that had wrapped itself around the mailbox post like it owned the place. My German shepherd, Boone, lay in the shade of the porch, one ear cocked, the other half missing from a run in with a coyote years before I adopted him. The envelope arrived in a plain white mailbox I'd painted myself, cream stock, embossed seal of the Port South County Court, Case 5192D, Whittaker vis. Whittaker. Petition for adverse possession and transfer of title. I read the names twice. Plaintiffs Robert and Margaret Whittaker. Defendant, Samantha Whittaker. My own parents were suing me for the 47 acres my grandfather had deeded to me the week he died. I laughed. One dry bark that startled Boone into a single woof. The kind of laugh that isn't funny, just inevitable. I carried the summons inside, set it on the pine table I'd refinished with my own hands, and stared until the words stopped swimming. Boone limped over, rested his graying muzzle on my thigh, and sighed like he'd seen this movie before. They always did like paperwork better than phone calls, I told him. It had been 13 years since I'd left home in dress whites, duffel slung over one shoulder, the other hand raised in a salute no one returned. I just graduated the Naval Special Warfare Pipeline, Hell Week, dive school, the whole crucible. Dad hadn't come to Coronado. Mom sent a single text. We wanted a daughter, not a warrior. I stopped asking for understanding after that. I served in logistics, the invisible artery that kept destroyers fueled, helicopters airborne, and extraction teams alive. I wasn't the face on the recruitment poster, but I kept the machine breathing. Pride was a private currency. Then came the rocket that turned a routine resupply run outside Marib into a fireball. I woke up in Landstuhl with a titanium knee, a folder full of discharge papers, and a pension that bought quiet. I purchased the cedar house outside Norfolk, fixed the plumbing myself, learned the names of every creak in the floorboards. My parents never called. Not once. That night I brewed coffee strong enough to strip paint and opened the sea chest that still smelled of salt and hydraulic fluid. Inside lay the dress blues, pressed and waiting like a patient ghost. Beside it, the triangular flag from Chief Petty Officer Marcus Delgado's memorial, folded so tight the stripes looked bruised. I hadn't touched the uniform since the cemetery in Arlington. My fingers found the jacket anyway. Boone watched, head tilted, as I held it to the window's last light. Time they met the real me, I said. Next morning I phoned the clerk. Your parents claim abandonment. She recited, apologetic. You'll need to appear if you contest. Abandonment. The word tasted like rust. Dad had hurled it the night I enlisted, grace under his nails, voice raw. You're walking out on your own blood. I'd answered. I'm walking toward something that matters. He never forgave the distinction. I drove past the farmhouse that afternoon. The wraparound porch sagged like a tired smile. the oak Grandpa planted the year I was born leaned drunkenly, half its branches dead. The man had built every inch with calloused hands after returning from Korea, every nail a promise. Wood remembers who hammered it. Sammy? He'd told me, whittling a whistle from cedar. Treat it honest. It'll hold. He'd left the place to me because I was the only one who listened. I felt no rage, only a hollow astonishment, like watching someone try to auction off your childhood diary. That evening, Boone snoring on the couch, I opened another envelope I'd kept sealed for years, my final fitness report. Commander Whittaker has served with valor that does not shout. Honor is often the discipline to arrive when no one claps. I read it twice, then laid the uniform across the ironing board and steamed out every wrinkle. Medals clinked softly as I pinned them: Bronze Star, Navy Commendation, the Silver Star I never talked about. In the mirror the next morning the jacket fit snug across shoulders, broadened by pull-ups on destroyer fantails and nights, hauling wounded friends to medevac birds. I looked like the officer I'd earned the right to be. For a second I considered jeans and a blouse. Let them think I'd come home diminished. Then I pictured Dad's smirk, Mom's averted eyes, and I buttoned the last button. Not today, I told my reflection. Boone barked once as I locked the door. The sun rose molten gold over the James River, and I felt the old calm settle in my bones, the kind that comes before a night jump into black water. The courthouse smelled of lemon polish and despair. I sat in the back row, spine straight, cover on my knee. Eyes followed the ribbons, the limp, the quiet authority that 13 years of command had etched into my posture. When the clerk called Whittaker vs. Whittaker, I rose. My knee protested, but muscle memory carried me forward. Dad had aged into a harder version of himself. Hair iron gray, scowl permanent. He wore the navy blazer he saved for funerals and court dates. Mom's pearls were the same, but her hands trembled. She whispered, "Uniform," like a curse when I passed. I took the defendant's table alone. No attorney. I didn't need a translator for the truth. Judge Harlan Brooks entered, robes sweeping, eyes kind behind wire rims. He glanced at my chest, paused, then began. Mr. and Mrs. Whittaker, you allege abandonment of the property at 114 Oak Hollow Lane. Dad leaned forward. Yes, Your Honor. House has sat empty 12 years. We've covered taxes, insurance, mowing. Objection, I said calmly. The word felt natural, like calling a course correction on a helo. I've paid every cent. Dad's head snapped toward me. Commander. The title hung in the air like cordite. Judge Brooks's eyebrows rose. Commander Whittaker, your statement. I opened a leather folio. Bank statements, canceled checks, county receipts, all stamped with my name and Navy Federal routing numbers. Since 2012 I've drafted the taxes from active duty pay, then disability. My parents haven't contributed a dime since grandfather's death. Dad's lawyer, a local in a shiny suit, sputtered. Where's the proof, Shay? I slid the stack across. The judge read in silence. Dad's face cycled through red, white, purple. Mom stared at the pearls in her lap as if they might confess. Judge Brooks removed his glasses. I don't usually digress, but Commander, were you the officer who orchestrated the Marib flood evac in 21? 47 civilians, 0 losses. Dad frowned. What evac? I nodded once. Yes, sir. The gallery murmured. A retired Marine in the back row stood without thinking. Judge Brooks's voice softened. I watched the body cam footage in a briefing. Proud day for Virginia. Dad's mouth opened, closed. Mom's hand slipped from his sleeve. The gavel fell like a judge's heartbeat. Petition denied. Property remains with Commander Whittaker. I gathered my papers. My hands shook. Not triumph, just the tremor of a burden sliding off vertebrae that had carried it too long. Outside, the August sun pressed down like a hot palm. Dad muttered something I didn't catch. Mom stood frozen on the courthouse steps, pearls gleaming against her throat like tiny accusations. A janitor saluted as I passed. I returned it. I drove to the harbor instead of home, parked beneath the same sodium lamp where I'd waited for my first deployment bus. The water slapped pilings, rhythmic and forgiving. I thought of Marcus Delgado teaching me to tie a bowline one-handed while joking that knots were just promises you could see. I thought of the letters I never sent, the care packages that arrived from strangers, the nights I woke tasting sand and blood that weren't there. Eventually I went home. Boone met me at the door, tail thumping a slow, arthritic rhythm. I hung the cover on its hook, folded the jacket with parade, ground precision, and set it on the chest like a relic I no longer needed to wield. The written ruling arrived 3 days later. I read it on the porch while Boone chased a lazy muth. Property confirmed mine. Taxes current, case closed. I folded the paper into a paper airplane and let the wind take it toward the river. I began repairs the next week. New shutters, pressure, washed siding, a porch swing rebuilt from cedar 2x4s. Every nail I drove felt like stitching a wound. I worked alone, radio tuned to classic country. Boone supervising from the shade. One Saturday Mom appeared at the foot of the ladder, holding a Tupperware of peach cobbler like a white flag. "Your father's stubborn," she said without greeting. "But he's wrong." I climbed down, wiped sawdust from my hands. "Cobbler won't fix 12 years, Mom." "No," she agreed. "But it's a start." She set it on the rail, then surprised me by picking up a paintbrush. We worked side by side until the sun dipped behind the corn. Neither of us spoke of court. We spoke of Grandpa's terrible jokes, of the summer I learned to drive stick in his old Ford, of the way he'd hum, "Anchors Aweigh," off-key while shelling peas. Dad came the following weekend. He stood in the drive for a full minute, hands in pockets, before walking up the path. "Swings crooked," he grunted. "Needs shims," I said. He produced a carpenter's level from his truck like a magician. We worked in silence, the only sounds the scrape of plane on wood and Boone's contented snores. When the swing hung true, Dad tested it with his weight. It didn't squeak. "Good work," he said. High praise. Sunday dinners began tentatively. Mom set an extra plate without asking. Dad carved the roast with the same precision he used on engine blocks. Conversation stayed shallow. Weather, the price of diesel, Boone's latest vet bill. But shallow water still reflects sky. One October evening Ryan showed up with his wife and 2 kids in tow. A casserole balanced on a potholder shaped like a crab. The kids ran wild through the fields while the adults drank sweet tea on the porch. Ryan studied the newel post I'd turned on Grandpa's old lathe. "You always were better with your hands than the rest of us," he said. I shrugged. "Had more practice." He bumped my shoulder. "Missed you, Sam, I am." The nickname stung and healed in the same breath. Thanksgiving we ate at the farmhouse. I cooked the turkey in Grandpa's cast iron roaster. Dad brought his mother's cornbread dressing recipe and stood over my shoulder criticizing the sage ratio until I handed him the spoon. Mom set the table with the good china she'd never trusted us with as kids. Ryan's daughter asked if I'd really jumped out of airplanes. I told her only when the pilot insisted. After pie, Dad produced a small cedar box. Inside lay Grandpa's service compass, the brass worn smooth. "He wanted you to have it," Dad said. "I was too proud to give it sooner." The needle trembled, then settled north. On the inside lid someone had etched in tiny letters, "Duty is love made visible." I closed it gently. "Thank you," he nodded, eyes wet. "Sunday dinners are at 6. Don't be late." Winter came early. I finished the interior. Hardwood floors sanded and oiled until they glowed like honey, a wood stove installed where the old fireplace had crumbled. I left Grandpa's navy portrait above the mantel, added one of my own, taken the day I made commander, Boone sitting at my feet like a furry executive officer. Veterans Day the high school invited me to speak. I wore caucus, no medals. The gym smelled of floor wax and teenage restlessness. I told them about a night off Aden when we pulled 12 fishermen from a sinking dhow while taking fire. I told them about coming home to a house with no welcome mat. I told them honor isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to move anyway. When I finished, a boy in the back row stood and saluted. The rest followed. I felt the old lump in my throat and swallowed it whole. Spring brought dogwoods and second chances. I planted a vegetable garden where the old chicken coop had collapsed. Tomatoes, okra, the peppers Grandpa called firecrackers. Mom showed up with heirloom seeds and stayed to weed. Dad built raised beds from scrap lumber, grumbling the whole time about city girls who didn't know dirt. Ryan's kids hunted Easter eggs among the rows, shrieking when they found the golden one I'd hidden in Boone's water bowl. One July evening a storm rolled in off the bay, thunder growling like artillery. Power flickered. We gathered on the porch, me, Boone, Mom, Dad, Ryan's family, watching lightning stitch the sky. Dad produced a bottle of bourbon older than I was. We passed it around, the burn cutting through humidity. To what acre stubbornness? Ryan toasted. To what acre forgiveness? Mom countered. I raised my glass. To coming home. Boone thumped his tail in agreement. Years later, when Boone's muzzle had gone completely white and his hips failed altogether, I carried him to the porch swing every evening. The farmhouse stood proud now, blue shutters, wraparound porch restored, American flags snapping above the door. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles when word spread I'd finally settled. Kids trick, or treated here, because the porch light stayed on. Dad and I built a ramp for Boone's last summer. Mom planted roses along the walk. Ryan taught his son to fish in the creek where Grandpa once taught me. The compass sat on the mantel, needle still true. Some nights I still woke tasting smoke, hearing Marcus call my name across a burning convoy. But the ceiling fan above my bed spun steady, and Boone's snores anchored me to the present. I'd learned the difference between surviving and living. One autumn afternoon a young sailor knocked on my door, freshly minted ensign, eyes wide with questions. I invited her onto the porch, poured sweet tea, listened to her fears about deployment and family who didn't understand. When she left, she saluted shyly. I returned it, then watched her drive away in a cloud of dust and hope. The porch light stays on now, not for me, but for anyone who needs to find their way home. The swing creaks gently in the breeze. Boone's grave lies beneath the oak, a simple stone that reads loyal to the end. I visit every Sunday after church, leave a dog biscuit and a story. If you take the back road at twilight, you might see us, 3 generations on the porch, arguing over whose turn it is to grill, laughing when the coals flare too high, passing slices of peach cobbler on paper plates. The uniforms hang in closets now, medals in drawers, but the discipline remains: show up, speak true, forgive hard. Grandpa's compass sits on the table between us, catching the last light. The needle hasn't wavered once. The years folded themselves into the farmhouse like pages in an old logbook, each one annotated with small, stubborn victories. I turned 40 the spring the dogwoods bloomed so thick the lane looked snow-dusted in pink. Mom insisted on a party. She arrived at dawn with grocery bags straining at the seams. Country ham, collards, 3 kinds of pie crust rolled thin on waxed paper. Dad followed in his pickup, cooler in the bed rattling with beer, and a single bottle of champagne he claimed was for the ladies. Ryan's kids strung fairy lights from the oak to the porch posts, shrieking when the extension cord snaked across the grass like a yellow python. I tried to protest the fuss, But Mom shut me down with a look that could still freeze gravy. "You only get 1/40th, Samantha Jane. Let us love you out loud for once." So I let them. Neighbors drifted in. Veterans from the VFW, the high school principal who'd heard me speak, the widow from down the road who brought a coconut cake taller than her grandson. Someone fired up the ancient record player Grandpa had wired into the barn. Patsy Cline floated over the fields like smoke. Boone's successor, a rangy black mutt I'd named Riggs after the helmsman who'd once saved my platoon, chased fireflies with the kids until his tongue hung like a pink flag of surrender. Dad manned the grill, apron tied over his Sunday shirt, flipping burgers with the same precision he once used to torque head bolts. Every so often he'd glance over, catch my eye, and lift his spatula in a small salute. The gesture had become our private Morse code. "I see you. I'm glad you're here." Mom pulled me aside as the sun slipped behind the corn. "Your father wants to give you something," she said, voice low, almost shy. She led me to the barn where the hay smelled sweet and sharp. Dad stood beside a tarp, covered shape the size of a small car. With a grunt he yanked the canvas free. Beneath it sat Grandpa's 1952 Ford pickup, restored frame up, midnight blue paint. Chrome bright enough to signal helicopters. Bench seat reupholstered in the same cracked red leather I remembered from childhood. "Been working on it nights," Dad said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Figured the farm needed its truck back. Figured you did too." I ran a hand over the fender, felt the ghost of every fishing trip, every load of firewood, every escape to the river when home got too loud. My throat closed. "Dad, this is yours," he finished. "Always was." I just held it hostage. That night we pushed the truck into the yard, headlights cutting twin tunnels through the dark. Ryan produced sparklers. The kids wrote their names in light against the sky. I climbed behind the wheel, turned the key. The engine caught with a cough and a roar, healthy as the day Grandpa parked it under the oak. Dad slid in beside me, Mom in the middle like always. We drove the back roads with the windows down, wind whipping our hair, Patsy still singing about walking after midnight. For the first time since I was 16, I wasn't driving away. Summer brought heat that pressed down like a wet blanket. I took to early mornings on the porch, coffee steaming, Riggs sprawled across my feet. The garden had gone wild, tomatoes fat as softballs, okra spears standing at attention, sunflowers taller than the fence. I canned salsa until the kitchen smelled like a taqueria, labeled jars in my careful block print Sam's Ferrascaris 2026. One August dawn the phone rang before the roosters. The voice on the other end was young, shaking. "Mom, this is Petty Officer Lopez from Norfolk. We've got a situation. Family emergency. Sailor needs extraction counsel. Your name came up on the resiliency roster." I was in dress khakis and out the door before the coffee cooled. The sailor was 21, fresh from boot. Wife 8 months pregnant, orders to Bahrain, panic in his eyes like a cornered animal. I sat with him in a fluorescent office that smelled of burnt popcorn and fear, walked him through emergency leave packets, talked him down from the ledge of what-ifs. When his wife went into labor early, I drove them to the hospital myself, held his hand in the hallway while he cried into his cover. The baby came out screaming, red-faced perfect. The new father looked at me, eyes swollen. "Ma'am, how do you pay this forward?" I thought of Grandpa's compass, of Dad's truck, of Mom's cobbler cooling on the porch rail. "You live it," I told him. "Then you teach your kid." Fall painted the fields bronze. Ryan's oldest started high school, joined ROTC. Asked if I'd pin his first stripe. The ceremony was in the same gym where I'd spoken years before. I wore my service dress, medals polished, knee aching from the weather change. When the boy saluted, crisp and earnest, something in my chest cracked open like sunrise. Winter holidays arrived with a nor'easter that dumped 6 inches of snow, rare enough to feel like a miracle in coastal Virginia. We strung lights along the porch again, this time with the whole family. Dad grumbled about extension cords, but climbed the ladder anyway. Mom baked cinnamon rolls that filled the house with yeast and memory. Ryan's wife taught the kids to make paper snowflakes. Riggs ate 3 before we noticed. Christmas Eve we gathered around the wood stove, fire popping, stockings hung from nails Grandpa had driven 70 years earlier. Dad produced a small box wrapped in the Sunday comics. Inside was a brass plaque, EST, 1954. Below it in smaller letters Hama Afkomandar S. Mabinasai Kakar USN Sardinas for the gate, he said gruffly. So folks know who keeps the light on. I traced the engraving with a thumb gone calloused from years of tools and triggers. Thank you. He cleared his throat. Your mother wants grandkids. Mom swatted him with a dish towel. I said eventually. Ryan raised an eyebrow at me. No pressure, Aunt Sam. I laughed until my ribs hurt. Spring again and the cycle turned. I planted peas in the row where Boone was buried, whispered to the dirt that loyalty grows deep roots. The high school asked me to coach a new mentorship program. Veterans guiding at-risk kids. We met in the barn I'd converted into a workshop, taught them to weld, to navigate by stars, to tie a bowline one-handed. One boy, quiet with scars on his knuckles, asked if I'd ever been afraid. Every damn day, I told him. Fear's just the price of caring. He nodded like I'd handed him a map. Years kept writing themselves in small gestures. Dad taught Ryan's son to drive stick in the old Ford, same way Grandpa taught me. 3 on the tree, grind the gears, curse creatively. Mom and I canned enough cho to supply the county fair. Riggs learned to herd the neighbors' escaped goats back through the fence, earning himself a reputation and extra treats. One July evening a storm took the power again. We lit kerosene lamps, played cards by candlelight, told stories until the candles guttered. Dad spoke of Korea. Things he'd never shared before. The cold, the letters he never answered from a girl back home who wasn't Mom. Mom admitted she'd kept every commendation letter the Navy sent, hidden in her Bible like contraband. Ryan confessed he'd watched the Marib footage on YouTube the night before court, cried in the garage so the kids wouldn't see. I listened. The weight of their confessions settling around me like warm blankets. When the lights flickered back on, nobody moved to turn them up. My 50th birthday fell on a Tuesday. I woke to the smell of bacon and the sound of hammering. Outside, the entire family, plus half the VFW, had erected a flagpole in the front yard. The plaque from Christmas now hung beneath a new sign, Dub Haytekar Lugasiwai Layen. Dad stood at attention in his old dress blues, mothball smell and all, eyes suspiciously bright. The flag went up slow and straight. When it caught the breeze, the stripes snapped like rifle shots. Ryan's youngest, now tall enough to reach the halyard, tied it off with a perfect cleat hitch I'd taught her years before. Mom handed me a cake. Chocolate, 3 layers, lopsided in the way only love allows. 50 candles flickered like a small battalion. I closed my eyes, made the same wish I'd made every year since Grandpa died. Let me be useful. They sang off key. Riggs howled along. Dad's voice cracked on the high note, but he didn't stop. Later, when the cake was reduced to crumbs, and the kids were asleep on quilts in the living room, Dad and I sat on the porch swing. The night smelled of cut hay and distant rain. He produced the bourbon again, older now, label faded. To 50 more, he said, clinking my glass. I smiled. Think the swing'll hold. He tested it with a creak. Grandpa built it to last. Silence settled, comfortable as flannel. Crickets stitched the dark with sound. Somewhere down the road a tractor coughed to life, then faded. "You ever think about selling?" Dad asked suddenly. I turned, surprised. "The farm." He nodded. "Cities creeping closer. Developers been sniffing." I looked out at the fields silvered by moonlight. The barn where I'd taught kids to believe in themselves, the oak that had shaded 4 generations of wetacres. "Not a chance." He exhaled, something loosening in his shoulders. "Good. Your mother wants to be buried under that dogwood by the creek, says the petals look like snow in April." I swallowed hard. "Plenty of room." He reached over, squeezed my knee, the same gesture he'd used when I was 8 and scared of thunderstorms. "You turned out better than any of us deserved, Sammy." I leaned my head on his shoulder, felt the wool of his jacket against my cheek. "Took a village. And a stubborn old man," he added. We sat until the bourbon was gone and the stars wheeled overhead. Riggs snored at our feet, dreaming dog dreams of endless fields. The next morning I found a new carving under the porch rail, fresh wood still pales estier NHS lovetichestiaid. Dad's knife work, blocky letters, no flourish. I traced them with a finger, smiled, and left them for the weather to season. Years later, when my own hair had gone the color of Boone's muzzle, and my knee required a cane carved from the oak's fallen branch, the farmhouse still stood. The porch swing had been rebuilt twice, the flag replaced a dozen times, but the compass on the mantel pointed true. Grandkids. Ryan's and the ones I'd claimed from the mentorship program. Fished in the creek, canned tomatoes in the kitchen, learned to drive in the old Ford. They called me Commander Sam, even when I insisted. Mame was fine. One autumn evening a young woman arrived at dusk, navy cover in her hands, eyes wide with the same fear I'd once worn. She'd heard stories, needed advice about deployment and a father who didn't understand. I poured sweet tea, led her to the porch. Riggs's great grandpuppy thumped his tail in greeting. We talked until the stars came out. When she left, she saluted, crisp, earnest, a little teary. I returned it, then watched her taillights disappear down Wetacre Legacy Lane. The porch light stayed on. It always does.